Greetings, and welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling instances in American history. Please let me know where you're watching from and what time you're listening to this narration in the comments section before we start. What locations and times of day or night these recorded stories reach are of interest to us. On the 17th of October 1913, a chilly and foggy morning broke over the southern Missouri Ozark Mountains. The rough limestone bluffs and thick oak woodlands that defined this remote area were obscured by a heavy layer of fog that clung to the valleys. People looking for isolation or an escape from the law, society, or their own pasts had long been drawn to the Ozarks because of their intricate cave systems and isolated hollows. Secrets might be buried there, both literally and symbolically, under soil that produced little but suffering for those who tilled it. When the telegraph arrived, Sheriff Thomas Hadley was at the Tenney County Courthouse, a small two-story building made of local limestone that stood in the heart of Forsyth, finishing his morning coffee. The courthouse housed the county's tiny law enforcement agency, as well as the seat of local administration. After returning from the Spanish-American War with a minor limp and a strong dislike of needless conflict, Hadley, now 52, had been sheriff for over 17 years. A mainstay at church socials and county meetings, his weathered visage, framed by a well-groomed gray beard, was a comforting presence in a town that valued independence, but nevertheless relied on neighbors in times of need. Roland Jenkins, a farmhand who frequently delivered to the county's more remote homesteads, sent the message. Given Jenkins' reputation for dependability and sobriety, and his refusal to engage in gossip or exaggeration, the urgency of his message was all the more worrisome. Accident at Blackwood Farm. Boy badly hurt. Something not right. Please come quick, the message stated. As Jenkins would subsequently explain in a sworn declaration dated the 19th of October 1913, what he had seen was the aftermath of what seemed to be a devastating agricultural accident. Shortly after sunrise, he had brought a delivery of supplies and seed that had been ordered the month before to the Blackwood farm. "I knew something was wrong," said Jenkins, "when I saw no smoke from the chimney, despite the morning chill. Then I heard the wailing, not like normal crying, but something that raised the hair on my neck." The Blackwood homestead was located on a narrow dirt road that wound through thick forest and opened onto a small clearing about 7 miles northeast of Forsyth. The property included a big barn, other outbuildings, a main home, a 2-story timber building constructed by James Blackwood's father in the 1882nd, and roughly 40 acres of cleared ground for cattle and crops. The family claimed ownership of hundreds of acres of woodland beyond that, but they had never been able to tame it. In 1902, after his father died of heart failure, the land was inherited by James Blackwood, according to county records. The elder Blackwood, who had branched out into occasional fur trapping and small-scale timber harvesting, had been one of the more prosperous farmers in the area. James, who was similarly diligent but less ambitious, had kept the farm in good, if not wealthy, condition. Sarah Mitchell Blackwood, his first wife, was the daughter of Reverend Mitchell of the Forsyth Methodist Church, a well-respected individual who had assisted in the founding of the county's first official school. William was born in 1902 as the only child of Sarah and James. The family was respected, if rather private, based on all accounts found in local documents and subsequent testimony. Sarah was well known for her sewing and preserves abilities and was involved in religious activities. One of her hand-stitched altar cloths, finished just months before her untimely death from illness in 1910, was still on display at the Methodist Church in Forsyth. With record-breaking low temperatures and a lot of snow, the winter of 1909-1910 had been especially hard, isolating many homesteads for weeks at a time. That season, a number of elderly individuals and little children had passed away from illness, but the community had been particularly saddened by Sarah's death at age 32. Prior to his unexpected marriage to Eleanor Carter in the spring of 1913, James had been somewhat reclusive after her death, concentrating on his son and the farm. The wedding had been a modest ceremony, as evidenced by the date of the 3rd of April 1913, and the signatures of 2 witnesses, neither of whom lived in the area, in the county clerk's records. Eleanor was from Springfield, according to the registration, and had previously worked as a seamstress at the Milligan & Sons Dry Goods Emporium on Commercial Street. It's unknown from the records how she and James met. According to some stories, he first introduced them to the city through his sporadic lumber deliveries, but other stories point to a more planned arrangement that was announced in a matrimonial ad in the Springfield Republican newspaper. There had been a subtle but noticeable wave of disquiet since Eleanor's arrival in the close-knit rural town. She was later told by Martha Wilkins, whose family owned the next closest property about 2 miles away, that Eleanor carried herself differently, like she was wearing an invisible crown. According to Martha's written statement, she wasn't unkind exactly, but she didn't take to our ways. Didn't join the quilting circle or help with canning. Kept herself apart and kept the boy closer than was natural for a lad his age. William's teacher, Miss Abigail Collins, had characterized him as a brilliant youngster, quick with numbers and letters, but naturally reclusive after his mother's death. He was 11 years old when his father remarried. Following his father's marriage, William's attendance at school became more irregular, according to the Spring 1913 school record book. On May 25, Miss Collins wrote a note expressing concern about the child's weariness and pallor when he did attend lessons. As he would later write in his official report, Sheriff Hadley arrived at the Blackwood farm on that misty October morning to find a scene that struck me as fundamentally wrong. The details, as related, simply did not align with any reasonable explanation. Jenkins, the farmhand, was waiting nervously by the gate, hesitant to return to the property. James Blackwood sat at the kitchen table in the main home, his face pale, his hands shaking a little as he held a mug of what looked like unopened coffee. With her dark hair drawn back in a stiff bun that highlighted the sharp angles of her face, Eleanor stood rigidly by the hearth. The boy was lying upstairs in a little bedroom that still had remnants of its former tenant, such as a faded daguerreotype of long-deceased grandparents, and Sarah's rosary dangling from a nail. His right eye was covered with a rough dressing, and his face was half-wrapped. Before the sheriff arrived, the county's sole doctor, Dr. Morris Fleming, had been called in and was repackaging his medical bag when Hadley walked in. Fleming shook his head, a move that expressed both personal and professional irritation. "Sheriff," he said softly, motioning for them to enter the corridor, "I've done what I can, but, after graduating from Louis Medical College, now the Washington University School of Medicine, Fleming had been practicing medicine in Tenney County for more than 20 years, treating anything from birth problems to farming accidents. It was difficult to shake him. In his years of practicing in the country, Dr. Fleming had never seen an injury like the one he described to Sheriff Hadley and later recorded in his medical file on the 18th of October 1913. The boy's claimed explanation that he had fallen on a farm tool while working in the barn was medically inconsistent with the nature of the wound. "The ocular cavity shows signs of trauma," he wrote, "but peculiarly, no remnants of the organ remain. It is as if the eye was not damaged, but rather removed with some precision. The surrounding tissue indicates the use of a sharp implement, though not one designed for surgical purpose." Furthermore, James Blackwood had become agitated when Fleming had demanded to view the disputed tool, stating that it had been cleaned and stored before reversing course, and speculating that it might have been thrown away because of blood contamination. Delivered with unnerving poise, Eleanor Blackwood's statement detailed discovering William already hurt and trying to help him before calling for help. She informed Sheriff Hadley, "I heard him cry out," while keeping her hands folded neatly in her lap and speaking steadily. She paused, her face briefly changing into something like satisfaction before returning to its worried mask. "By the time I reached the barn, he was already on the ground. There was so much blood. I did what any mother would do." Hadley found the statement strange. After all, Eleanor was not William's biological mother, and based on the reports of her neighbors, she had not done much to take on a maternal role in the 6 months since she married James. When she mentioned William, there was something in her voice that made the sheriff's neck stand up, a feeling he had grown accustomed to during his time in law enforcement. William's subsequent interview provided no insight. Hadley's careful interrogation elicited only the tiniest answers from the youngster, who was pale and frighteningly motionless in his cot. His statement is transcribed in the sheriff's precise handwriting. "I was in the barn, then I wasn't," it says. William apparently glanced at the wall behind the sheriff for almost a full minute when asked if his stepmother was present at the ceremony. He then reportedly said, "She takes care of me now." Following more testing, Dr. Fleming concluded that although William's eye loss was irreversible, he was not in any immediate danger. He recommended bed rest, frequent boiled water cleansing of the wound, and a follow-up appointment in 3 days to look for infection symptoms. He pulled Sheriff Hadley aside again before leaving. Fleming said, "There's something else," looking toward the stairs to make sure no one else could hear. "The boy's remaining eye, the left one." Throughout the inspection, he avoided looking at me. Sheriff Hadley's anxiety was heightened by this disturbing observation, which was not proof of any particular wrongdoing. When I finally managed to check it, the pupil was dilated far more than ambient light would explain, and he flinched when I moved my hand near his face, as if. The doctor hesitated, as if he expected me to try to take that eye too. However, the sheriff could not do much official action because there was no concrete proof of a crime, and James Blackwood insisted that the incident had been a tragic accident. Having promised to return in a few days to see how William was doing, he left the Blackwood property with a growing suspicion that something evil was hiding beneath the surface of this remote homestead. Like the morning mists that clung to the Ozark Hollows, a weird quietness descended upon the Blackwood farm in the weeks after William's injury. During his 3 visits to the homestead, Dr. Fleming recorded that the boy's recovery was proceeding without infection, but that the child remains unnaturally silent. On the 7th of November 1913, the doctor wrote in his private journal, which was later found among his belongings after his death in 1931, "The wound heals cleanly, too cleanly perhaps, given the rustic conditions and reported circumstances. Mrs. B. appears to have some knowledge of wound care beyond what one might expect of a seamstress." When I asked her about this, she mentioned an uncle who had served as a surgeon's assistant during the war between the states. A believable explanation, but one that was delivered with such practiced precision as to raise questions. The incident was met with a similarly muted response from the community. Although accidents were frequent in rural areas and usually led to a flood of help, including food delivery, offers of labor aid, and prayer circles, there was something about this specific catastrophe that seemed to prevent the customary displays of communal support. As Reverend Mitchell of the Forsyth Methodist Church later wrote in his personal correspondence to his brother in Kansas City, "A darkness has fallen over the congregation regarding the Blackwood matter. Questions are asked in whispers, if at all." James, who once sought comfort in prayer following Sarah's passing, has not attended services since the boy's injury. When I called upon them to offer spiritual guidance, I was received with such cold courtesy as to feel my presence was an intrusion. The stepmother, Eleanor, spoke mostly of the child's good fortune in having her nursing skills, rather than expressing gratitude for his survival or divine protection. She referred to William's remaining eye as sufficient for her purposes, a phrasing that has troubled my thoughts and prayers since. This letter, preserved in the archives of the Kansas City Public Library as part of the Mitchell family papers, provides one of the few contemporaneous accounts of the atmosphere surrounding the Blackwood family during this period. When investigators eventually interrogated the neighbors, the majority acknowledged that they had purposefully avoided the farm after William was hurt. They gave a variety of explanations, from respect for the privacy of the family to vague worries about the change that had come over the place. One of the few who kept intermittent touch with the Blackwood household was Martha Wilkins, whose sense of Christian duty ultimately overcame her discomfort. Although not immediately applicable, her observations contributed to the mounting body of concerning information about the case. "The boy never played outdoors anymore," she said in the 8th of December 1913 statement to Sheriff Hadley. "Before, even after his mama died, you'd see him running with the dog or climbing that big oak by the creek. Now he just sat, either on the porch or by the window, like he was watching for something. And the dog, that old hound that used to bark at everything that moved, it was gone. When I asked after it, Mr. Blackwood said they'd given it away because the barking agitated the boy's condition. But William loved that dog something fierce. An almost palpable tension began to permeate the Blackwood farm. James used to frequently attend community events and the general shop in Forsyth, but these days, he only showed up for necessary business in town. Neighbors noticed notable changes in his behavior when he did go out. J.B. purchased usual monthly supplies, plus unusual quantity of salt, appeared haggard, hands shaking. When asked about family, responded curtly that all were as could be expected, declined credit for first time since establishment of account in 1902. Noted Elijah Thompson, the general store owner, in his business ledger next to the Blackwood account. Eleanor was hardly ever seen. The few times she went to town with James, she stayed in their wagon, a shadowy presence watching the main street of Forsyth with what a number of witnesses characterized as eerie vigor. Youngsters, whose perceptions were unfiltered, started to tell tales about the Eye Lady, saying that even when she appeared to be facing ahead, she was actually watching them via the wagon's tiny rear window. The property itself was in poor condition, with crops that had only been partially harvested and cattle that was emaciated and agitated as winter drew near. The thin, sporadic smoke rising from their chimney indicated that the hearth was not being properly maintained in the ever-colder temperatures. In a community where managing heat sources well during the severe Ozark winters was essential for survival rather than just comfort, this seemingly insignificant element was actually important. The case took a significant turn on the 7th of December, 1913. In an act of kindness masquerading as neighborly courtesy, Martha Wilkins traveled a considerable distance to the Blackwood farm with a basket of preserved goods, driven by anxiety and the imminence of Christmas. The temperature had risen to almost 50 degrees by midday, making the day unusually warm for December and producing a false sense of spring that Martha would later characterize as deceptive, like the calm before a storm. Her findings led her to return to Forsyth immediately and make a frantic report to Sheriff Hadley. The sheriff's log includes her statement, written in his precise writing. The boy was sitting on the porch, thin as a rail, with that bandage still on his eye. When I called out, he didn't respond, just stared with his good eye. When Mrs. Blackwood finally came out, she stood so close behind him that her skirts brushed his shoulders. She thanked me for the basket but didn't invite me in, and, Sheriff, I swear on my Bible, when she smiled, William flinched like he'd been struck. Martha's account went on to include elements that suggested a deep sense of wrongdoing, even though they did not specifically point to criminal action. The house behind them was dark, all the curtains drawn despite the pleasant day. I caught a whiff of something from inside, not the usual cooking smells or wood smoke, but something sharp and medicinal. When I mentioned that William looked thin and offered to bring by some of my chicken stew later in the week, Mrs. Blackwood said, "He has no need for your charity. I provide everything he requires." Then she put her hand on his shoulder, and I saw her fingers press into him so hard they left white marks on his shirt. The event that occurred as Martha was getting ready to leave was the most upsetting to her. I asked William directly if he was feeling better, trying to get him to speak to me like he used to. He opened his mouth, but before he could make a sound, Mrs. Blackwood said, "Tell Mrs. Wilkins how well you're doing with your lessons, William. And that boy, who used to chatter about birds and stories and numbers, he just repeated, 'I'm doing well with my lessons, Mrs. Wilkins.' But, Sheriff," his voice wasn't his own. It was flat, like he was reading words without understanding them. And when I looked into his good eye, it seemed vacant, like nobody was home behind it. After considering Martha's concern, Sheriff Hadley determined that a second official visit to the Blackwood property was necessary. He and Dr. Fleming traveled together the next day, December 8, reaching the farm just after midday. Only the essential details of their contacts with the family and doctor. Fleming's medical evaluation of William's recuperation process are included in their unusually subdued official report of their visit, but in a different private notebook that was discovered among Sheriff Hadley's belongings after his passing. A tiny leather-bound diary where he jotted down ideas and observations that he felt were too subjective or speculative for official records. He wrote, "Approached the Blackwood place with Fleming around midday. Unlike Martha's account, no one was on the porch. Had to knock 3 times before James answered. His appearance shocked me. The man has aged years in weeks. Gray now streaks his beard, and his eyes are deeply shadowed. He seemed both relieved and alarmed to see us, glancing repeatedly over his shoulder as we spoke on the porch. Eleanor appeared as if summoned by some silent signal. Unlike James, she shows no signs of strain. Indeed, she looked somehow stronger, more substantial than at our last meeting. She positioned herself between James and the door, ostensibly to offer us coffee, which we declined, but the effect was to control his access to the house interior. When we requested to see William, a strange negotiation seemed to unfold between husband and wife, not in words, but in glances. Eventually, Eleanor went upstairs to prepare the boy. As she put it, the 7 minutes of her absence were silent and strained. James did not speak except to answer direct questions, and then only in monosyllables. The house itself felt wrong. Too cold despite the fire visibly burning in the hearth. Too quiet despite the normal creaks and settling sounds of an old timber structure. William, when finally brought downstairs, moved like someone much older or infirm. The bandage on his right eye was clean and professionally applied, more skillfully than I would have expected from home care. As Fleming examined him, I observed the boy's reactions. He responded to physical stimuli, flinching appropriately when Fleming tested sensitivity around the wound, but his emotional responses seemed muted or delayed, as if reaching him through some filter. Most telling was his reaction when Fleming asked about his daily activities. William looked to Eleanor before answering, his gaze seeking permission or guidance. She smiled and nodded slightly, whereupon he recited what sounded like a prepared statement about reading, simple mathematics, and helping with indoor chores. When Fleming asked specifically what he had read recently, William hesitated, then said, "Mother Eleanor reads to me from the special book." Eleanor quickly interjected that she had been reading him selections from Pilgrim's Progress, an appropriate choice for his moral education. The boy nodded agreement, but Fleming later told me he believed the child had never heard of the work before that moment. Before departing, I asked to use their outhouse, a pretext to observe the rear of the property without raising suspicion. The barn where the accident allegedly occurred was padlocked, unusual for a working farm in daylight hours. More concerning were the scratch marks on the inside of the back door of the main house at approximately the height a child might reach. When I casually mentioned these to James as I returned, Eleanor answered for him. The previous owner kept hunting dogs inside during winter. Such destructive creatures. According to county records, the Blackwood family has owned this property since 1883, and to my knowledge, they have never kenneled hunting dogs indoors. Sheriff Hadley's suspicions were aroused by this visit, but there were not enough grounds for an official involvement. Rural Missouri's 1913 statute granted authorities limited authority to get involved in family affairs unless there was unmistakable proof of criminal behavior. William was being fed and housed. There were no outward indications of abuse or beating, and although the household's peculiarities were worrisome, they did not provide a foundation for legal action. The growing picture was further enhanced by the physical examination performed by Dr. Fleming during this visit. His notes on this examination include the following entry. Healing progresses normally, though the socket appears to have been cleaned with unusual thoroughness. When I inquired about the specific care regimen, Mrs. Blackwood answered promptly, describing a solution of boiled water and salt. The boy's reaction to her voice, a slight tensing of the shoulders, a downward gaze, suggests an unnatural deference, or perhaps fear. Of additional note, William's remaining eye shows signs of prolonged weeping, though no tears were evident during our visit. In a separate communication to a medical colleague in Street, Louis, dated December 12, 1913, discovered in 1967 during cataloging of the Washington University Medical Archives, Fleming expressed more direct concerns. I have encountered a most troubling case that tests the boundaries of both medical ethics and my obligations as a citizen. The injury itself, the complete removal of a child's eye in supposedly accidental circumstances, defies logical explanation given the reported mechanism of injury. More concerning is the subsequent behavior of the patient and his caretakers. The stepmother displays a level of medical knowledge inconsistent with her background, particularly in wound management, and what appears to be the administration of sedative substances. The father exhibits signs of duress or coercion. The child demonstrates symptoms consistent with prolonged psychological trauma beyond what the physical injury would explain. I find myself in the uncomfortable position of suspecting harmful intent without adequate evidence to justify intervention. Rural practice often requires one to respect family privacy and autonomy, but in this instance, I fear that such respect may enable ongoing harm. The law provides little recourse without more substantive proof of wrongdoing. I document everything meticulously in hopes that, should my concerns prove founded, there will be a record that might have helped prevent whatever may come. The Blackwood case may have been forgotten when 1913 gave way to 1914, another tragedy in the harsh Ozarks, where disfiguring injuries and early death were all too common. The winter grew more severe, with weeks of below-freezing temperatures and a lot of snowfall. Even short trips became challenging, and until the spring thaw, the more isolated homesteads essentially vanished from the neighborhood. However, something happened on the 28th of January 1914 which sparked new local worry. William did not show up for class after the winter break. Following the Christmas vacation and customary January hunting season, the Forsyth School, a modest one-room building that educated kids aged 6 to 14 over the nearby 10 square miles, reopened on January 20th. Following her responsibilities as a teacher, Miss Abigail Collins wrote to the Blackwood farm to ask how William was doing and when he would be returning after he had been gone for a week. The answer was given in person rather than in the form of a note. Following dismissal on January 30th, James Blackwood showed up at the schoolhouse, seeming, as Miss Collins would later testify, like a man who had not slept in days. He carried a note purportedly signed by Dr. Fleming suggesting that William stay at home to regain his strength. As she told Sheriff Hadley, "His manner was strange," said Miss Collins. "He would not meet my eye, and when I expressed hope for William's swift recovery, he simply nodded and turned to leave. I called after him, asking if William might benefit from schoolwork sent home, as he had always been an eager student. Mr. Blackwood paused at the door and said very quietly, "Eleanor believes his education is best managed at home now." There was something in his tone, resignation perhaps, or fear, that troubled me deeply. That same evening, Miss Collins, a conscientious teacher who genuinely cared about her students, made the extraordinary move of going to see Dr. Fleming to find out how William was doing. She informed Sheriff Hadley right once after learning that Dr. Fleming had not authored the letter and had not seen William since the sheriff's visit on December 8. This disparity led to a more official inquiry. On the 3rd of February 1914, Sheriff Hadley returned to the Blackwood farm with a warrant to inspect the property, now accompanied by County Prosecutor Edgar Wilson. Although the warrant's legal justification was comparatively weak, suspected medical fraud and educational neglect, it gave the authorities necessary to carry out a more comprehensive investigation of the property and the family's art. Circumstances. Nothing obviously criminal was found during the subsequent search. No indications of unlawful activity or physical abuse serious enough to warrant the child's removal. When asked apart from his father and stepmother, William insisted that he was receiving good treatment, although he spoke in a monotone and kept his eyes on the ground. In response to a specific question concerning school, he said, "Mother Eleanor teaches me important things now, things they don't know at school." According to Sheriff Hadley's report, the youngster seemed to be well fed, albeit slender, and dressed for the weather. His eye socket had fully healed, but there was no replacement eye available. Instead, a straightforward black patch had taken the place of the bandage. Hadley and Prosecutor Wilson both saw that William's surviving eye was strangely lifeless. The blue that the neighbors and former teacher had described as vivid had now turned to a flat, nearly gray color. The Blackwood residence's interior was a contrast study. Unwashed dishes, filthy surfaces, and clothes left unrolled were all indications of neglect in the primary living spaces, the kitchen, parlor, and James's bedroom. Eleanor and William's quarters, on the other hand, were carefully arranged, The only personal belongings in William's bedroom were clothes and a little wooden horse that was crafted in a manner that Martha Wilkins subsequently recognized as resembling toys her late husband had created for neighborhood kids. The majority of the books and trinkets one might anticipate finding in a child's room were not there. Beside the bedroom she allegedly shared with James, although the state of that room indicated he no longer slept there, Eleanor had a private sewing room that was locked. She produced a key from a chain around her neck when requested to open it. There was a sewing table, a few bolts of black fabric, and a writing desk with a leather-bound journal that Eleanor swiftly pushed into a drawer, explaining that it held private household accounts. The room beyond was spotless, but what the search did find was a little wooden box tucked under Eleanor's sewing room floorboards. Despite not being illegal, the items found inside the box were extremely unsettling to the investigators. 5 small teeth that appeared to be human and childlike. Several locks of dark hair tied with string, which matched William's coloring, and a small glass vial that contained what appeared to be a preserved animal eye, although Dr. Fleming would later write in his personal journal that the specimen bears a disturbing resemblance to a human organ. Eleanor Blackwood maintained her composure when questioned about these matters. Prosecutor Wilson found the loose board by noticing a tiny change in the wood's coloring and the more recent look of the nails holding it in place. This was the first time Eleanor's prior marriage or childbearing had been mentioned. "Mementos," she explained, "from my own lost children." James Blackwood, who was present throughout this exchange, was genuinely shocked by the discovery, but did not dispute his wife. No records confirming this claim have ever been found in Springfield or the surrounding counties. James gave a halting explanation in a later private conversation with Sheriff Hadley that was recorded in the sheriff's personal notebook. Eleanor doesn't speak of it often. It pains her too deeply. She was married young in St. Louis before coming to Springfield. There were 3 children, all lost to fever within a month of each other. Her husband abandoned her soon after. The mementos are all she has left of them. After Hadley pressed for specifics, including names, dates, and the locations of graves, James became agitated and finally acknowledged, "I don't rightly know those particulars." Eleanor finds such questions distressing. The inquiry came to a standstill. Despite their horrific appearance, the objects in the box were obviously what Eleanor claimed to be. Although suspicious, James's account's inconsistencies did not amount to a crime. Even while his affect remained bland and his answers were prepared, William insisted that he was not being hurt when questioned directly about his treatment. Frustrated by the absence of concrete proof, Prosecutor Wilson proposed to Sheriff Hadley that they may utilize the educational neglect defense to at least temporarily remove William for evaluation. Wilson countered, "The boy is clearly being isolated." According to Hadley's notes of their discussion, "At minimum, we could get him away from that woman long enough to determine if he's being coerced or drugged." However, children were not given much protection under the laws of the time, especially in rural areas where home education was common and parental authority was regarded as almost absolute. Dr. Fleming, who was contacted on the subject, voiced concern about William's already precarious psychological health and the possible impact of forced separation. "The boy has lost his mother, his eye, and possibly his sense of safety," said Fleming. "Without clear evidence of immediate danger, removing him from familiar surroundings might cause more harm than good." Although they set up a routine of routine welfare checks on the Blackwood farm, Sheriff Hadley and Prosecutor Wilson reluctantly ended the case without taking any further action. The results of the first of these, which was carried out on the 17th of February 1914, showed that nothing had altered. During the second visit, which took place on March 5th, Eleanor stayed within arm's reach of William at all times, and he appeared to have gained some weight and spoke more readily, though still with that peculiar flatness of affect. In the Ozarks, the winter of 1914 was especially severe. Many homesteads were isolated for weeks at a time due to heavy snowfall, which made it challenging to continue the planned welfare inspections. Between mid-March and early April, the already isolated Blackwood farm became nearly impossible to reach. Regular contact with the outside world didn't return until the spring thaw, and by then, The community's focus had mostly shifted to other issues, such as getting ready for spring planting, a controversial local election, and the far-off rumblings of trouble in Europe that would eventually turn into the First World War. Martha Wilkins returned to the Blackwood farm on the 17th of April 1914, precisely 6 months after William's first injury. She would later tell Sheriff Hadley that she had a dream in which she saw William beckoning to her from the edge of the forest, his face hidden by shadows. This dream was the reason for her visit. 3 nights in a row, the dream had come back so vividly that Martha, who is not usually superstitious, felt obliged to inquire about the boy's well-being. At the farm, she discovered James Blackwood by himself, using deliberate, nearly mechanical motions to split wood in the yard. He hesitated as Martha came closer, the axe slackly at his side, his face expressionless for a time before recognition set it. "Mrs. Wilkins," he said, his voice sounding as though he had been out of commission, "what brings you out this way?" Martha asked after William and Eleanor, saying that she was visiting nearby farms following a long winter. James told her that they had traveled to Springfield to speak with a specialist on the boy's prosthetic eye. They would be gone, he said, for at least a week. There was something about James's demeanor that genuinely disturbed Martha. In her statement to Sheriff Hadley, she wrote, "He wasn't himself. His hand shook when he offered me coffee, and he kept looking at the stairs like he expected someone to come down. When I asked him exactly when they had left for Springfield, he gave me 3 different answers in the course of our conversation. First, that they had left yesterday morning, then that the stage had taken them on Tuesday, which would have been 3 days prior, and finally that Eleanor had been planning the trip since Sunday week, indicating they had left even earlier." Martha, with the insight of someone who had known James Blackwood for more than 10 years, gently pressed him on these contradictions. He became agitated, she stated, dropping a cup which shattered on the floor. "When I moved to help him clean up the pieces, he nearly shouted at me to leave them. 'You'll know if they're moved,' he said, then immediately tried to laugh it off as a joke about his wife's attention to detail. But there was real fear in his eyes, Sheriff. Not the kind of fear a man has of his wife's displeasure, but something deeper. Martha requested if she might leave some fresh bread and preserves for the return of the family before she left. For the first time in months, James led her into the kitchen. Martha noticed a number of unsettling things while she was there. A lot of salt in open containers, a disproportionate number of knives spread out on a spotless cloth, and most alarmingly, what looked like bloodstains on the floor near the cellar door, half hidden by a rug that had been hurriedly moved, its edge still folded back. Already suspicious of the Blackwood scenario, Sheriff Hadley made the quick decision to look into it. Samuel Tucker, his deputy, was sent to Springfield to make inquiries at the offices of the city's 2 eye experts. There was no documentation or awareness of a consultation with a boy called William Blackwood or any patient who fit his description. Additionally, there was no record of passengers with such names in the previous week for the stagecoach company that ran the route between Forsyth and Springfield. On the 18th of April 1914, soon before dusk, the sheriff personally made his way back to the Blackwood property. The official sheriff's report of that night is extremely brief, stating only that the property seemed deserted and that repeated knocks were not answered. The condition of the residence when Sheriff Hadley eventually forced access is something that isn't mentioned in the report, but that he later disclosed to Reverend Mitchell. The rooms had been thoroughly cleaned and cleared of all personal belongings. Despite the spring chill, the fireplace was frigid, indicating that no fire had been built for days. The bloodstains Martha had noticed were gone from the kitchen, which had been cleaned to a near-clinical sterility. There were no personal belongings on the dressing table or clothes in the drawers in James and Eleanor's bedroom. They seemed to have never been there. The discovery in William's chamber was the most unsettling. The linens had been removed from his bed, and a rough symbol that looked like an eye was etched into the wooden headboard. Below it, written in a less steady hand, were the words, "She sees." In the middle of the naked mattress, with its carved eyes gouged out, stood the miniature wooden horse, the only toy Martha had reported seeing in the room on her previous trips. At first look, the cellar, which was accessible through a door on the kitchen floor, appeared to be filled with tools, stored foods, and other everyday items of country life. However, Sheriff Hadley found a tiny gap in the far end's earthen wall, partially hidden behind a pile of empty crates. Beyond it was a room about 6 feet in size, with a packed earth floor and timber-reinforced walls. A child's ankle-sized manacle was at the end of a chain that was fastened to one wall. There were black stains on the floor of this secret room, and a small stack of ripped and similarly soiled fabric in the corner turned out to be a child's nightshirt. No immediate indications of the family were found during a search of the adjacent property. The majority of their clothing and possessions were gone, along with their wagon and lone horse. The Blackwoods seemed to have just packed up and moved on, which was not unusual in the ephemeral rural settlements of the day. However, their hurried departure, the contradictions in James's story to Martha Wilkins, and the unsettling findings in the house created serious concerns. Sheriff Hadley sent out alerts to nearby counties asking for details regarding the Blackwood family's whereabouts. No leads surfaced for a few weeks. A station manager in Joplin, a few hundred miles west of Forsyth, then reported seeing a woman and a boy who fit Eleanor and William's descriptions getting on a train headed toward Kansas City in early May 1914. This report, which was sent to Sheriff Hadley via telegraph on the 6th of May 1914, had a number of elements that increased rather than decreased anxiety. In contrast to Eleanor's prior modest appearance, the station master, Horace Jenkins, described the woman as expensively clothed and displaying a demeanor that suggested wealth or at least large means. During their transaction, the youngster, who had a patch over his right eye, was described as uncommonly still, like a mechanical toy awaiting winding. He didn't say anything, and while he was speaking directly to the woman, he gazed at her before shaking his head or nodding. Jenkins's comment on the couple's luggage was the most concerning. One of their possessions was a high-quality leather doctor's bag that momentarily collapsed while being loaded. I glimpsed medical instruments inside, scalpels and the like, which seemed odd for travelers of their description. When I commented on it, the woman said curtly that her late husband had been a surgeon and the tools were a keepsake. But Sheriff, I've seen enough doctor's bags in my 20 years at this station to know those tools were neither keepsakes nor standard traveling equipment. They were surgical instruments, clean and apparently ready for use. Some relief that William was at least alive and moving might have come from this sighting, but Sheriff Hadley was greatly worried by a detail in the station master's account. James Blackwood had not been mentioned as being among them. The station master was certain that the girl and boy had gone alone when he was questioned about it. On the 12th of May 1914, Sheriff Hadley, growing increasingly alarmed by James's disappearance, planned a more exhaustive search of the Blackwood estate and the adjacent woodland. The result of this search was a somber finding. James Blackwood's body was discovered in a tiny cave about half a mile from the main home, partially hidden by previously disturbed rocks and soil. Clinical details are provided in the coroner's report dated the 14th of May 1914. Deceased appears to have suffered multiple blunt force traumas to the skull and upper torso. Death likely occurred 3 to 4 weeks prior to discovery. Most notable is the condition of the eyes. Both have been removed with what appears to be a sharp implement, with minimal surrounding tissue damage, suggesting deliberate extraction rather than animal predation or natural decomposition. The report also noted ligature marks on the wrists and ankles, indicating James had been restrained prior to his death. His murder occurred during the time he said Eleanor and William were in Springfield, as evidenced by stomach content that indicated he had been dead for at least 20 days. The findings were as follows. Manner of death, homicide. The wounds and restraint marks indicate deliberate, sustained violence rather than a spontaneous altercation or accident. When James's body was found, the case changed from one involving exceptional circumstances to one involving murder. Eleanor Blackwood and William, who are now thought to be either her victim or unwilling accomplice, were the targets of a multi-county manhunt. Police departments in Missouri, Kansas, and Arkansas received telegram notifications, even as far afield as St. Louis. Newspapers carried articles about the Ozark Eye Killer, although the majority of them concentrated more on the dramatic elements than the real facts. Aware that Eleanor and William might have come by train, the Kansas City Police Department made inquiries at lodging facilities, boarding houses, and transit hubs. There have been several alleged sightings, but none have been verified. Although he was unable to provide any precise information that might help track them down, a cashier at the Union Depot remembered a woman and boy of similar description getting on a westbound train that was likely destined for Denver or beyond. Based on the few information available, Sheriff Hadley created a more thorough profile of Eleanor Blackwood, despite having few resources and an increasing belief that William was still in danger. As part of their investigation, the Springfield Police Department went to the Milligan & Sons dry goods emporium, where Eleanor had allegedly been employed as a seamstress. Although the address Eleanor Carter gave a boarding home on North Jefferson Street turned out to be a lie, the store's employment records verified that she had worked there from 1911 until the beginning of 1913. The establishment's owner has never heard of an Eleanor Carter. Subsequent research showed that Eleanor had hardly ever interacted with other workers and had been employed based on letters of recommendation from Pryor Street, Louis employers, which turned out to be fakes. The other girls didn't care for her. The store manager stated, describing her as competent but cold, with a peculiar intensity about her. She asked too many questions about their families, especially their children. This pattern of fabrication and meticulously crafted fictitious history raised questions about William's safety by implying a degree of planning and preparation. What further deceptions could Eleanor be able to pull off if she had deliberately constructed a false persona and blended in with the community quite effortlessly? And why did she particularly target the Blackwood family in the first place? The trail was unproductive in spite of these efforts. The sighting in Joplin turned out to be Eleanor and William's final verified report. They may have gone as far west as California or Oregon, where they might have easily vanished amidst the steady stream of migrants looking for a fresh start, according to some investigators' theories. They may have retreated, hiding somewhere in the vast, remote Ozarks itself, according to some. All of 1914 and 1915 saw the case remain open but unsolved. Then, in August of 1915, something odd happened. The Tenney County Sheriff's Office received a box that was expressly addressed to Sheriff Hadley. A tiny journal with a worn and discolored leather cover was found within. It came with a note that read, "Found this washed up along the White River after the spring floods, but thought it might be of interest to the law." The handwriting did not match any samples known in the sheriff's records, and the note was unsigned. Eleanor Blackwood owned the journal. Beginning with routine descriptions of her life in Springfield and her marriage to James, the entries spanned the period from March 1913 to April 1914. Eleanor was portrayed in the early entries as a lonely widow, in need of security and company after losing her husband and children to illness. This account aligned with what she had told James, but it was also refuted by the absence of documentation proving that such a family had ever existed. The writings in the journal became more and more unsettling as time went on. By June 1913, Eleanor was calling William the vessel rather than her stepson, and she continued to write about his perfect blue eye and how it watches me, knows me, must be mine. She also wrote about having dreams in which she was able to see through other people's eyes and experience their thoughts and memories as though they were her own. An important change was noted in an entry dated July 30th, 1913. The ritual requires preparation. The first extraction must be practiced to ensure the second succeeds. The animal subjects prove inadequate. The connection fades too quickly. Only human material will sustain the transfer. The boy's right eye will serve for the trial. His mother's blood flows in him, making him a more suitable conduit than James. Other entries frequently mentioned William's mother, Sarah. Eleanor seemed certain that Sarah had had some unique talent or insight that she desired. Eleanor wrote, "She knew the old ways," on the 5th of September 1913. The church songs and quilting bees were just a cover. The women in town speak of her still with awe disguised as respect. They don't realize what she was capable of, what power she held. But I know. I've always known when I've found another like me. Intricate preparations were described in the entries preceding William's injury in October, including the manufacture of preservation solutions, the practice of making precise incisions on unidentified subjects, and the gathering of salt and herbs that Eleanor thought would improve the ritual's effectiveness. She explained how she arranged farm tools in the barn to bolster her theory of an accident. The entry for October 17, 1913, the day that William suffered accident, was chillingly straightforward. It is done. The right eye now rests in solution, properly preserved. The boy's screams nearly brought James running before I was finished, but the sedative in his morning coffee kept him confused enough for me to manage the situation. The extraction was cleaner than expected, barely any tissue damage. I feel it already, the connection forming. Flashes of his memories come to me. Sarah teaching him to read, the dog they had before I arrived, places in the woods I've never visited. But it's not enough. I need the left eye too, the one that has seen me, that knows what I am. Only then will the transfer be complete. Eleanor's increasing dissatisfaction with the incomplete bond she felt she had created by owning William's right eye was chronicled in later posts. She detailed tactics used to keep William and James under control, including psychological manipulation, subliminal threats, and sedatives in their diet. She wrote, "James suspects something. In December 1913, he watches me when he thinks I'm not looking, but I'm always looking now through William's eye. I see how James hides small objects, a knife under his mattress, a letter he tried to send to the sheriff. He'll need to be dealt with before I can complete the work." Eleanor's developing belief that William's remaining eye held some unique power or understanding was described in the final notes, which were written in an increasingly erratic hand. She penned, "The left holds what the right has seen," on the 15th of April, 1914. The allusion to the others and her seeming obsession with William's late mother were never explained in detail in the notebook. "When I have both, I will know everything he knows. I will see what he has seen, the truth about Sarah, the truth about the others, in full detail." The journal did disclose Eleanor's intention to remove William's remaining eye and her subsequent escape to an undisclosed place where she had prepared. On April 17, 1914, the final entry said unequivocally, "James is no longer a concern. The boy and I leave tonight. The final extraction will occur at the prepared site by the next full moon. I will see through both vessels, and the transfer will be complete." These disclosures severely troubled Sheriff Hadley, who relaunched the search for William with greater vigor. The journal implied a habit of planned, ritualistic violence motivated by delusions, or possibly some perverted religious system in addition to murder. The 3-year-old youngster would now be in serious danger if he were still alive. But despite enhanced search efforts and a hefty reward offered by worried people of foresight, no further evidence of either Eleanor or William was located. If not for a fortuitous discovery in 1937, more than 20 years later, the case may have gone unsolved forever. Workers discovered a little cellar beneath the house that had burned down years ago while building a new county road close to Springfield. They discovered human remains inside, including the bone of a youngster who was between 11 and 13 years old when they died and had unusual damage to both of its eye sockets. According to the property records, a E. Carter, most likely Eleanor, had bought the house in February 1913 prior to her marriage to James Blackwood. The fact that Eleanor had purchased this house months before she met James, creating a place she could return to, demonstrated a degree of premeditation that had not been taken into account in the case before. Despite the limitations of the time's technology, forensic analysis of the remains showed that the kid had most likely asphyxiated to death. More concerning was proof that the person had lived for a while following the removal of both eyes, as shown by the incomplete healing of the socket edges. A little metal button that matched those on William's school coat, and a carved wooden horse figure that, like the one Martha Wilkins had remembered giving William on his 11th birthday, were among the personal belongings discovered with the remains. The majority of investigators thought the remains were those of William Blackwood, even if the identification could not be verified with full confidence. Because it was believed that Eleanor Blackwood could not possibly be alive or at large after so many years, the case was formally closed in 1938 and she was recorded as deceased. In 1952, however, the case was supplemented with an intriguing footnote. After reading about the Blackwood case in a collection of old Ozark mysteries, a retired nurse from a Nebraska mental hospital got in touch with the Tenney County Historical Society. According to Meredith Holloway, the nurse, the institution had housed a woman who identified herself as Eleanor the Seer from 1914 to 1926. She was admitted after being discovered wandering the streets of Omaha wearing clothing smeared with blood, and she claimed to be able to see through the eyes of others. She also kept a collection of small glass vials that the staff initially thought contained colored alcohol or water. Letter to the Historical Society. She was an unusual patient, Holloway noted. Unlike most of our residents, who were either agitated or despondent, she maintained a strange composure. She spoke rarely, but with perfect clarity, often seeming to know things about staff members that she couldn't possibly have learned through normal means. Details about their homes, their families, private matters never discussed at the institution. Several attendants refused to work in her ward, claiming she would whisper their secrets as they passed her door. According to Holloway, Eleanor the Seer was not her legal name. She had been admitted as Jane Doe, and later given the administrative title, Patient 317 inches, the institution's records. Her propensity to make predictions about the future, many of which unsettlingly materialized, gave rise to the moniker. She predicted the influenza epidemic weeks before the first cases reached Nebraska, said Holloway. There was something in her eyes, a depth, an awareness, that seemed beyond normal perception. The woman had passed away in the institution in 1926, and her personal belongings, including the vials, had been disposed of in accordance with standard procedures. She described the crash of the Holiday Building in Omaha 3 days before it occurred. The staff began to attribute these correct predictions to newspaper reports she might have glimpsed or conversations she might have overheard. But I always wondered. There were no surviving fingerprints or photos that may identify her as Eleanor Blackwood. Decades after the incident, and without any supporting paperwork, the nurse's statement was submitted as an intriguing but unsubstantiated postscript to the case. When the historic Tenney County Courthouse was being renovated in 1968, workmen found a small metal box sealed inside a wall cavity close to the location of the sheriff's office. It contained a number of items that Sheriff Hadley, who had passed away in 1943, had reportedly concealed: Eleanor Blackwood's original journal, a number of official case-related documents, and most unsettling of all, a glass vial that contained what would later be determined to be a preserved human eye with a remarkably blue iris. A handwritten note with these items read, "I keep these things hidden because I cannot destroy them, yet I fear what might happen should they fall into certain hands. The journal contains knowledge that no person should possess. The eye, sometimes I believe it watches me still. I dream of a woman with no eyes of her own who sees through the eyes of others. I dream of William Blackwood, still alive somehow, still calling for help from the darkness where she keeps him." These are old man's nightmares, perhaps, but I have seen too much in this case to dismiss even the most fantastic possibilities. Should anyone find this collection after my passing, I urge them, bury it deep, or better yet, burn it. Some mysteries are not meant to be unraveled. Notwithstanding this caution, the finding led to a temporary resurgence of interest in the Blackwood case among law enforcement and local historians. The preserved eye was examined using contemporary forensic methods, which verified that it belonged to a boy who fit William's age and description. Although DNA testing, which was still in its infancy in 1968, was unable to establish a direct connection between the eye and the skeletal remains discovered close to Springfield, anatomical similarities in the orbital measurements indicated that they most likely belonged to the same person. The analysis of the journal itself was the most fascinating. Experts in handwriting verified that all entries were written by the same person, but they observed minor variations in writing pressure and style as the journal went on, which could be attributed to growing psychological distress or, as one expert put it, a fundamental shift in personality, as if the writer were becoming someone else. Stains on multiple pages were identified by chemical analysis as being human blood from at least 2 different people. These discoveries, while scientifically interesting, did little to clarify the underlying problems surrounding the case. What had drove Eleanor Blackwood to her apparent preoccupation with William's eyes? What relationship did she suppose existed between herself and Sarah Blackwood? Most troubling of all, what did her journal writings about seeing through William's removed eye indicate about the nature of human vision and consciousness, if there was even a glimmer of truth amidst the glaring delusions? Eventually, the preserved eye, the journal, and the other items were sent to the State History Archive, where they were stored and mostly forgotten, aside from the odd researcher who happened to be interested in old Ozark crimes. A true crime writer's attempt to write a book about the case in the early 1970 seconds briefly reignited public interest, but the project was shelved after the author claimed to have encountered inexplicable visual phenomena while studying the archives, such as lingering afterimages and the feeling that he was being watched whenever he handled the original materials. What was William Blackwood's real fate? Why did Eleanor seem to be so fixated on his eyes? And it is still unclear how this might have been related to Sarah Blackwood's passing years prior. Secrets have long been kept in the remote towns of the Ozark Mountains, some of which are as deeply ingrained as the voids between the old hills. Even now, some elderly locals in isolated parts of Tenney County continue to caution kids against going out on their own in the woods close to the location of the former Blackwood farm. Speaking softly of the woman who collects eyes, they say that on especially gloomy evenings, a lantern may occasionally be seen walking amid the woods, being carried by a figure with a smooth, featureless face in place of eyes. We might never know if these tales are the logical progression of folklore from a true tragedy, or if they are based on a more profound reality concerning Eleanor Blackwood and her potential transformation. Every year, the woodlands cover the foundations of the old Blackwood homestead. The case files accumulate dust, and somewhere, maybe, a blue eye watches still, perceiving all but disclosing nothing.